Over the last 3.5 years, we've seen a change in the momentum in the fight against anti-Israel delegitimization and BDS. People sometimes ask me, is BDS really such a threat? And I answer, it hasn't become a threat because we've taken action to make sure that it doesn't become a threat. During the first weeks after I became Strategic Affairs Ministry, the CEO of Orange announced that the company would be leaving Israel. I believe you remember it. BDS groups almost succeeded in having Israel suspended from FIFA, and the British National Student Union adopted a boycott of Israel. So I decided that we needed a much more proactive approach to countering BDS, including research to reveal the true nature and goals of the BDS campaign, its connections to terrorism and anti-Semitism. There is no doubt that 3.5 years later, we are in a very, very different place. More and more leaders and decision makers are not only rejecting BDS, but taking concrete steps to oppose it. There is now legislation and regulations against BDS in 26 US states. There is also governmental decisions in the UK, and in Berlin, in Frankfurt, and in Munich. Courts in France and Spain have repeatedly ruled that BDS constitutes illegal discrimination. And banks in 5 countries have closed BDS-linked accounts. And more people are coming to Israel, of course, as you know, that in 2018, we had a record number of tourists visiting Israel, and I think that means a lot. Unfortunately, often when people talk about the goals of the BDS movement, they don't bother to read the official statements from its leaders. If you do, it becomes clear that the goals of the leaders of the BDS movement are the same as those of the Palestinian terrorist organizations. Because both BDS and the terrorist groups reject Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state within any borders. Both want to see Israel wiped off the map. They promote different means for achieving this goal. We have always seen indications of connections between BDS groups and designated terrorist organizations. So I instructed my ministry to carry out in-depth research into this issue. What we discovered surprised even us. We discovered over 100 connections between Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which are both terrorist organizations designated by the US and the EU, and 13 leading Palestinian, European, and US BDS groups. In these 13 BDS groups, we identified the involvement of 30 current and former terrorists, including 20 who had spent time in prison for their terrorist activity, some for the murder of Israeli civilians. When I say over 100 connections, I mean people who by day fill senior positions in NGOs that promote BDS, and by night are members of terrorist groups. Or people who formerly were active members of terror groups and now recruit other members into their NGOs. I also mean fundraising for BDS groups by well-known terrorists and funds transferred by terrorist groups from the Middle East to Europe by so-called civil society activists. And I also mean joint campaigns and lobbying efforts in parliaments, especially for the release of senior terrorists from Israeli prisons. And now I ask you to really think about it. Think about it. You have active members of terrorist organizations who have undergone military training by groups such as Hezbollah, who walk around the European Parliament presenting themselves as civil society activists while lobbying for boycotts of Israel and the release of terrorists. When we discovered this vast web of connections, we came to the following conclusion. The terrorist organizations know that carrying out terror attacks is no longer considered legitimate in most parts of Western society and media. They therefore have adopted BDS as a parallel and complementary track to terrorism. From their perspective, BDS is a convenient way to delegitimize Israel, undermine its right to self-defense and international standing, receive funds from European governments and Western funds, and carry out political lobbying. My ministry will present to you many of the connections that we have discovered. And I would like to say a few words about our next steps, because we're not going to stop with only publishing this important report. I intend to share this report with the International Homeland Security Forum that I established together with Homeland and Public Security ministers from around the world, as well as with other law enforcement bodies, members of parliament and government officials. First of all, we're calling on them to examine the terrorist ties of NGOs operating in their countries. Secondly, we're calling on all governments, EU institutions, philanthropists, banks, and fundraising platforms to immediately end all support for organizations linked to terror. Our goal, as you remember from what I did in Jerusalem when I outlawed the northern branch of the Islamic movement, and when I outlawed the Morabitun and the Morabitat, our goal is for them to examine outlawing these kind of organizations because of their ties with designated, sometimes convicted terror activists. These institutions and philanthropists should not be supporting organizations which promote anti-Israel boycotts, and certainly not those that are connected to terror in any way. As I said, there is a growing understanding of the true nature of BDS. Banks in 5 countries have closed BDS accounts, and several European countries have decreased their support for BDS supporting groups or activity. Just last month, we provided the US-based fundraising site DonorBox with research that showed that terrorist organizations that are directly connected to the leading, maybe the most leading BDS organization, the so-called Palestinian BDS National Committee, or as you know it as BNC, which uses DonorBox. As a result, DonorBox suspended the BNC's account. I have no doubt that the publication of this report will lead to further steps to stop the funding to these organizations. My request to you as journalists, when you are approached by NGOs involved in promoting boycotts of Israel while waving the banner of human rights and peace, please keep in mind that many of these organizations not only share the same ideologies as terrorist groups, but are linked operationally, financially, and logistically to terrorist organizations. And these are the facts.